Paul mentioned parity in the procurement process, but there's parity and there's parity. There's a real benefit to having true access and control over your source base that is often not accounted for when they create these parity regulations. And we've talked about this in our memos, but accounting for what that means. So if you have two equivalent contracts from a functionality standpoint, and in one you have the extra advantage of retaining the source code and thus having more negotiating power, say once the contract expires in a year or two, that should be valuable, right? Should that be 10% more valuable, 15% more valuable than the closed source implementation? Maybe, you know. I've never felt that we should say proprietary software should be at a significant disadvantage to open source during procurement, but there's a value in open source that proprietary simply doesn't have, and I've always thought that procurement rules should allow for that. So,
if I could just build off of something you said, Chris, and that's, you know, I think a lot about the relationship between proprietary software or systems and open source software systems, and you know, I really think that they need each other. And what I mean is that, you know, the proprietary folks, it will always exist. I don't think we'll ever find a world where there's only open technologies. And I wouldn't really want to live in that world, necessarily, because if someone sees an opportunity for some innovation to happen, they have the wherewithal to make it happen, and they have a customer who's willing to pay for it, they have no incentive to keep it open. They can quickly, very quickly produce this innovation because they don't have to work with a larger collaboration with other people. They can just make their product and sell it. And if it's worth something, if it's really innovative, then it's going to pick up in the market, and people are going to start to buy this thing. And then what's going to happen is, eventually, an open source community is going to come along and begin to commoditize it. All right. Cisco is running into this very problem with their hardware. It's interesting. Cisco is a software company kind of wrapped in a hardware company's body, because their core product is really the iOS platform. And so they, you know, Cisco's, I have a lot to thank them for. Arguably, without them, the internet wouldn't be what it is today. It might not be as deployed as it is today, at the very least. But look at what's happening, all right? They've gone out and they've innovated in a proprietary way, Cisco has. And now you've got some very interesting open source router platforms that are running on commodity hardware, very, very inexpensive hardware being produced in Asia. And sure enough, these open source software routers are performing very, very well, and they're actually starting to compete with Cisco. They're much, much less expensive.
Certainly at the switch level.
At the switch level, this is certainly happening. And look at how Cisco's reacting. You know, they're moving more towards into the video space and trying to stack more value on top of the network instead of just sell switching gear.
Yeah, but I'd say that that's a natural evolution of technology in which once something's well understood, that it becomes commodified.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in that very moment means that there's lots of low-cost, low-level innovation, and that market advantage is gone. And actually, patent law as conceived was supposed to create and ride on that space. That's why the patents were originally 7 to 15 years, because in the 1800s you would have fulfilled that natural exploited period and been rewarded. And then commodification should happen, and a lot of people should be able to just do it. And that was a pretty good understanding of, we're talking about non-electronic technologies at that point, and I think was very prescient and reflected a market behavior, and also where a small number of people were being exploited as inventors. In the case of Cisco, just like Intel moving from memory chips to processors, they correctly see much later, frankly, than Intel in the cycle, that their work has become a commodity and moved on. As I look across the room, I see an interesting mix of computers that are using open source software with a proprietary wrapper around it. How many people have Macintoshes here? All running the allegedly open FreeBSD, or allegedly free, it is open.
Did
Did you guys have to ask Steve before you could open your laptop today?
They did have to have a license that they signed to do it, so there is have contractual permission.
Yeah, but they're going to the point where you have to call them before you actually come.
They don't do that, but they did sign a contract.
Yeah.
That's actionable. So he knows he may be in touch with you now.
He's emailing more.
But just to show, one, that there's prevalence, that there's an open source at base, but proprietary wrapped around it, and then you have Adobe, which is exactly the reverse. A proprietary system with a bunch of open source stuff wrapped around it.
So for me, the bottom line is pretty much that you'll always have both. And the open source people and the proprietary people in kind of a weird way need each other. Well, first off, they are the same people, but they kind of need each other in this weird, it's a healthy tension that's going on here. And yeah, I think proprietary does have its place, and it'll never go away completely.
Well, that leads me